Excellencies, I welcome this opportunity to brief you concerning the situation in Ethiopia. In August, I warned the Council that a humanitarian catastrophe was unfolding before our eyes in Ethiopia, and since then, the crisis has worsened. Up to 7 million people in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar are now in need of food assistance and other emergency support. This includes more than 5 million people in Tigray, where an estimated 400,000 are living in famine-like conditions. Humanitarian aid is still not reaching the area at anywhere close to the levels needed. The only option for road transportation into Tigray is along the Afar corridor, where movements are being severely restricted by official and unofficial checkpoints, insecurity, and other obstacles and challenges. Some minor improvements that are welcome did not change the fundamental nature of the problem. Vital food supplies continue to be blocked, as are essential medicines and equipment. Humanitarian organizations continue to lack the cash they need to operate and to pay their staff. Access to electricity remains precarious. Millions of people are cut off from communication networks and vital services such as health care. And fighting in Amhara is another serious impediment to humanitarian access. As a result of all these facts, life-saving humanitarian operations are being crippled. Our colleagues on the ground are sharing increasingly alarming eyewitness testimony of the suffering, including growing accounts of hunger-related deaths. And in locations where screening has been possible, we are seeing acute malnutrition rates that remind us of the onset of the 2011 Somalia famine. We are also seeing deeply worrying reports of violations of human rights abuses perpetrated by all sides. I am particularly concerned about chilling accounts of violence against women and children, including sexual and gender-based violence. Mr. President, the UN is also actively engaged in humanitarian support to other regions of Ethiopia with pressing needs. The country is facing an immense humanitarian crisis that demands immediate attention. All efforts should be squarely focused on saving lives and avoiding a massive human tragedy. This makes last Thursday's announcement by the government of Ethiopia to expel 7 senior UN officials, most of them humanitarian staff, particularly disturbing. This unprecedented expulsion should be a matter of deep concern for us all, as it relates to the core of relations between the UN and member states. As expressed in the note verbal to the Mission of Ethiopia from the Office of Legal Affairs and shared with the Council a few days ago, and I quote, "A declaration by a state that an official of the United Nations is persona non grata, accompanied by a request or demand that the Secretary General consequently relocate that official out of its territory, is not consistent with the Charter obligation and is inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the International Civil Service enshrined in the Charter. The procedure on such matters is clear. As the note verbal states, if the government has any specific issues concerning any individuals, the relevant information should be brought to the attention of the United Nations to enable the Secretary General to make a decision as to whether any appropriate action should be taken. In other words, there is a proper, formal procedure, and that procedure was not followed. The United Nations will continue to play its mandated role and work with the government of Ethiopia and with local and international partners to support millions of people in need of humanitarian assistance in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, and across the country, in full accordance with UN Charter and General Assembly Resolution 46/182. I now call on Ethiopian authorities to allow us to do without hindrance and to do this without hindrance and to facilitate and enable our work with the urgency that this situation demands. This means ensuring that visas for incoming personnel from UN entities and from our partners are issued quickly so that we can augment our capacity. Delays we have witnessed in the recent past are another obstacle to effective humanitarian aid. It also means that personnel inside the country are treated with dignity and respect as they carry out their vital work. Our focus remains on ensuring humanitarian assistance to every Ethiopian who needs it. We must save lives and restore livelihoods. I urge the government to allow the unrestricted movement of desperately needed food, cash, communications equipment and humanitarian supplies into all the regions in need. And I appeal to all members of Security Council to do all they can to support these calls and to unify behind the efforts of the United Nations and its partners in Ethiopia. Last August, in this Council, I called for action on several fronts. As I said then, and I quote, all parties must immediately end hostilities without preconditions and seize that opportunity to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Foreign forces should leave the country. Unrestricted humanitarian access to all areas in need must be guaranteed, and humanitarian workers must be respected. Public services must be re-established. His appeal is even more pressing today. Any further escalation of the conflict would only make the situation more tragic. Mr. President, important political events have taken place in Ethiopia since my last Security Council briefing in August. Just 2 days ago, a new government of Ethiopia, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has inaugurated. The mandate conferred by the election carries a responsibility to unite all Ethiopians, to focus on the future, to return Ethiopia to its place as a strong, unified, stable leader among the nations of the world. I encourage the newly inaugurated government to use this mandate and work with renewed determination to be a government for all. I welcome the Prime Minister's inauguration remarks prioritizing an inclusive political dialogue involving all segments of the community to resolve the ongoing challenges facing the country. I also note the many messages from African heads of state emphasizing the need for harmony, national unity, development and peace. I urge all sides to grasp the peace initiative from the AU and his High Representative for the Horn of Africa, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo. Without peace, the challenges facing Ethiopia will intensify and further destabilize the broader Horn of Africa region and beyond. We have an obligation to avoid such a dire outcome at all costs. Mr. President, dialogue is the foundation for peace, and peace is the foundation for a stable and prosperous future. Let us all work to help secure that future for all Ethiopians and for the peoples of the region, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your important and timely briefing today. Ireland joined with others in calling this meeting because we believe that the recent expulsion of UN leadership from Ethiopia should be addressed publicly by this Council. This expulsion is particularly egregious in the context of the continuing deterioration of the humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia. It cannot be excused nor ignored. Last Friday, Martin Griffiths told us that 5.2 million people require humanitarian assistance and 400,000 are living in famine-like conditions in Tigray. 80% of pregnant and lactating women are acutely malnourished. Perhaps most worryingly, child malnutrition rates are similar to those recorded at the onset of the Somalia famine in 2011. Let's be clear about what this means. Ethiopian children are starving. People are dying because they cannot access food, water, and basic health care. This is not a situation caused by natural disaster. It's caused by those who continue to choose the path of war. The ongoing effective blockade of Tigray including systematic efforts to prevent medicines and medical supplies from reaching the region, is costing lives. As the conflict spills over into neighbouring Amhara and Afar regions, the humanitarian crisis is spreading. In these circumstances, we need a fully operational, unimpeded and proportionate humanitarian response, reaching all those in need of assistance and protection in northern Ethiopia and across the country. The decision of the Ethiopian government to expel senior UN staff undermines its working relationship with the UN when it needs it most. As outlined by the EU High Representative on Monday, it risks the further weakening of efforts to bring relief to millions of Ethiopians in need at a moment when aid organisations already face serious impediments in carrying out their mandates. Unfounded allegations and consistent targeting of humanitarian workers put all humanitarian work in the country at risk and are unacceptable. Safeguarding the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality and independence ensures that aid can arrive where and when it is needed most. As others around this table have previously done, I call on all parties to the conflict to depoliticise humanitarian aid. Secretary General, you made clear to us when we last met and in your recent letter that the conflict in Ethiopia is spiralling out of control. We were warned of this months ago. Ireland, a long-standing friend of Ethiopia, has been drawing attention to this and its inevitable consequences for the people of Ethiopia since we joined the Council. We ended our last meeting with you, Secretary General, in agreement that quiet diplomacy should be given a chance. Despite such efforts, we continue to receive reports of inflammatory, dehumanising language. As you said today, Secretary General, any further escalation would only make the situation more tragic. We continue to receive reports of conflict-related sexual violence and atrocities, denial of access to humanitarian aid, and attacks on humanitarian workers which may amount to war crimes. Those who commit such violations must be held accountable. Before we see the tragedy worsen even further, before we see more young people needlessly lose their lives to this war, all sides must accept there can be no military solution to the crisis. Mr. President, let me reiterate the three key asks of many of us here at this table. First, we are asking all parties to the conflict to immediately ensure full, unimpeded and safe humanitarian access required in accordance with international humanitarian law. The blockade on Tigray must end now. The basic services must be restored. Food, medicines and fuel cannot be restricted to just a fraction of what is required. Without immediate and scaled up action, the horror of mass mortality caused by political decisions once again will tragically overwhelm parts of Ethiopia. Second, we all want to see an immediate cessation of hostilities between all parties to the conflict and for them to come to the table to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Eritrean forces also need to withdraw from Ethiopia. And third, we need a political solution to the crisis in Tigray, as well as an Ethiopian-led inclusive national dialogue that promotes the unity of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the African Union has a crucial role to play in engaging with all sides, supporting mediation efforts and ultimately assisting Ethiopia in finding a solution to this crisis. Ireland looks forward to hearing an update from the AU High Representative Obasanjo at the next available opportunity. To conclude, Mr. President, Ethiopia's government has a historic opportunity and indeed a new mandate to turn the tide towards peace and to steer the country back onto the hopeful path of just a few years ago. We are approaching the 1-year anniversary of this conflict. It must end. It's time for Ethiopia's leaders to deliver the peace, unity and prosperity which all Ethiopian people deserve. The alternative is catastrophic, prolonged and expanding conflict that threatens to destroy Ethiopia's ambition for a prosperous and peaceful future. We simply cannot afford to miss this opportunity. Thank you, Mr. President.
ክቡራንና ክቡራን ይህ ሳይበር ፓወር ኦፍ ትግራይ ሚዲያ ነው። በቀጥታ ዩናይትድ ኔሽን ዛሬ ስለ ኢትዮጵያ ስለ ትግራይ የሚያስተላልፈውን በቀጥታ እያስተላለፍንላችሁ ነው። ከኛ ጋር እንድትቆዩ በትህትና እንቆያለን። የኦስቶኒያ ተወካይ አሁን ያቀርባሉ።
Wholeheartedly support the statement you made today, last Thursday, and also your letter sent to the Security Council on this matter. Estonia strongly condemns the decision of the government of Ethiopia to expel 7 UN officials, including humanitarian and human rights officials. These personnel were responsible for the invaluable and difficult work of delivering life-saving aid to Ethiopia and helping the Ethiopian people with the unfolding man-made humanitarian catastrophe. It is essential that UN humanitarian operations are immediately allowed to resume in full capacity in Ethiopia. UN humanitarian operations are guided by the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, and they have our full confidence. Any accusations against UN workers and humanitarian personnel of breaches of these principles should be accompanied by clear evidence. There is a process for handling any such concerns, and this has not been followed. The expulsion of the UN officials from Ethiopia undermines the efforts to alleviate the dire humanitarian situation and further endangers the work of humanitarian aid workers in northern Ethiopia, where they are already facing violence and harassment. Mr. President, all parties to the conflict have an obligation to facilitate safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all areas affected by conflict and ensure the protection of humanitarian workers in line with international humanitarian law. We urge the government of Ethiopia to take further steps to ensure sustained access for aid convoys to Tigray, to restore public services in the region, and to allow food, fuel, and medical supplies to enter. Only 11% of needed aid entering the region is not acceptable. At the same time, we call upon the Tigray forces to stop their offensive in neighboring Amhara and Afar regions and to facilitate humanitarian assistance to hundreds of thousands of displaced people. Furthermore, we underline the importance of concluding the joint investigation into the allegations of human rights violations and abuses, in particular against human rights workers. The continued reports of these violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and international human rights are deeply worrying, and accountability for these violations must be ensured. Finally, I reiterate that there is no military solution in Tigray. The newly appointed cabinet in Ethiopia has a mandate from the people and an obligation to bring about a prompt and peaceful solution to the conflict, and also ensure that people of Ethiopia do not die of hunger. I urge the parties to immediately cease hostilities, ensure protection of civilians, and minimize the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing conflict. This should be followed by an inclusive and credible political process with the aim of national reconciliation. In this context, we also reiterate the role of the African Union and encourage their continued engagement in this crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
President, I'd like to thank, first of all, the Secretary General for his presence with us today and also for his briefing. I would like to also commend the commitment of UN personnel deployed in Ethiopia. Given the humanitarian emergency, France expects that the Ethiopian authorities fully cooperate with the United Nations and with all international partners. France condemns the decision of the Ethiopian government to declare 7 UN officials persona non grata. France and the European Union will continue to support civilians who have been so gravely affected by the conflict, as we've seen through our financial contributions to the humanitarian response in the north of the country, as well as a humanitarian air bridge established by the EU, France and Italy. This support means that UN personnel and all humanitarian actors can work safely and fully in line with principles and humanitarian law. And France calls on the Ethiopian authorities to guarantee full access for all humanitarian personnel and to respect their own commitments. We will not tolerate intimidation or violence against humanitarian personnel. The lifting of the blockade that's in place is a precondition for any sort of resolution of this ongoing conflict. Here, like elsewhere, only a political solution will bring an end to this crisis. France fully supports the 3 points made today by you, Mr. Secretary General. Ceasefire is vital to respond to this emergency and to create the necessary conditions for a resolution. We once again call for a verifiable and controlled withdrawal of Eritrean forces from Ethiopian territory, particularly from Western Tigray. In return, we call on Tigrayan forces to demonstrate sincerity and to reinstate regional borders of Tigray. It is finally important that a compromise be found with the Amhara forces on the border dispute between the two regions within the framework of the Constitution. Reconciliation is only possible if they fight against impunity. France is looking forward to the publication, planned for the 1st of November, of the report of the joint inquiry led by the High Commission for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Commission for Human Rights. We take note of the commitments made by the Ethiopian government to identify and prosecute those responsible for human rights violations. France will support all efforts for dialogue which seek to preserve the unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We take note of the commitment of the Prime Minister to organise an inclusive national dialogue, and we call him to launch this as soon as possible. France also supports the efforts of President Obasanjo, who will be received tomorrow in Paris. We encourage all international actors, starting with the United Nations, to provide all the support needed for his work to succeed. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. On Friday, we were shocked by Ethiopia's expulsion of 7 UN officials. And today, we are profoundly dismayed by Ethiopia's failure to reverse this untenable decision. The man-made humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia is getting worse by the day, and famine has, most probably, already taken hold. In this context, the expulsion of essential UN officials, key humanitarian leaders, is deeply disturbing. President, it is unacceptable that Ethiopia chooses to obstruct the important work of crucial UN organizations. The UN is delivering life-saving aid to people in desperate need, impartially and in all parts of Ethiopia. The UN is not a party to the conflict in Ethiopia. On the contrary, Norway firmly believes in the impartiality and professionalism of the UN and its personnel. We are steadfast in our support of the UN and wish to reiterate our request that Ethiopia immediately reverse the expulsion of 7 staff members. President, to end the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Tigray, the federal Ethiopian authorities, the TPLF and other armed actors must ensure rapid, safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to the region. They must do their utmost to facilitate the work of humanitarian organizations and their personnel, and fully respect international humanitarian law by providing security for humanitarian workers. We deplore the ongoing vilifying comments made regarding humanitarian actors. Such hateful rhetoric is state-led dangerous and is putting lives at risk. This situation hit those already vulnerable the hardest, including those facing famine, those displaced, and more often than not, women and children. Indeed, the denial of humanitarian access during conflict is one of the 6 grave violations against children. There must be a response to this. Norway also condemns in the strongest tone the reported killings of civilians and the widespread and systematic use of sexual and gender-based violence. All alleged atrocities and violations by all sides must be documented and investigated. Accountability for such acts is critical for prevention, deterrence, and justice for victims and survivors. President, Norway strongly supports the appointment of former President Obasanjo as the AU High Representative on the Horn of Africa, and we ask the parties to actively engage with the High Representative. This Council, at a bare minimum, should declare in support of his endeavours and unified in its support for the United Nations, its humanitarian agencies and UN staff. If we cannot do this, we have failed. We must urgently and with one voice speak out in support of this, together with an immediate ceasefire, a political dialogue, unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need, and an immediate reversal of the expulsion of the 7 UN officials. I thank you.
እዚ ሳይበር ፓወር ኦፍ ትግራይ ሚዲያ እዩ ተከታተልትና በአጠታይና እናልፈልኩም ዘለና ይህ ሳይበር ፓወር ኦፍ ትግራይ ሚዲያ ነው
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your briefing. Mr. President, I start by paying tribute to UN staff around the world who work tirelessly to deliver humanitarian aid, assessing and addressing needs on a neutral, impartial basis. I think we all agree that their life-saving activities should not be politicised, and that Member States should make every effort to support and facilitate their work. That is why the United Kingdom, like many of Ethiopia's partners, is deeply disappointed by the government of Ethiopia's decision to expel 7 UN officials. The strength of international concern about this is apparent in the fact that over 40 countries quickly joined a joint statement delivered by the United Kingdom at the Human Rights Council in Geneva on the 4th of October. Mr. President, as we have heard and seen, the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia is critical. The UN personnel who were expelled were dealing with the increasingly acute needs of those in the north of Ethiopia. The UK Special Envoy for Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Affairs visited Tigray and Amhara last week and saw firsthand the UN's efforts to respond to this emergency. The removal of key UN personnel will have a direct impact on the ability of the international community to deliver vital humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this is not the only obstacle to delivering aid. Personnel will have a direct impact on the ability of the international community to deliver vital humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this is not the only obstacle to delivering aid. Personnel will have a direct impact on the ability of the international community to deliver vital humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this is not the only obstacle to delivering aid. full support for him, the African Union and the United Nations as they work to end this tragic conflict and help those in need. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your briefing to us this afternoon. First and foremost, I want to offer solidarity and support to the United Nations during this trying time as they work to save lives. The United States called for this urgent meeting today, given the events that have transpired over the last week. The Ethiopian government's reckless expulsion of 7 key UN officials, including the head of UNICEF, the head of UN OCHA, and a senior official from the Office of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, are an affront to this Council, to the United Nations, and to all member states, and our shared humanitarian principles. There's no justification for the government of Ethiopia's action, none at all. Nor did the government of Ethiopia follow the proper process for calling attention to its concerns, as we've heard from the Secretary General today. What could be the justification for expelling the UN focal point responsible for ensuring food and humanitarian assistance reach those who need it? What could be the justification for expelling the UN focal point for the well-being of children in Ethiopia? There's none. And as the Secretary General made clear, U.S. personnel cannot be declared persona non grata. The UN is impartial. The UN is neutral. And in Ethiopia, it is delivering life-saving aid, including food, medicine, water, sanitation supplies, to all people in desperate need. And it is conducting important human rights investigations in conjunction with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. U.S. personnel barred from Ethiopia must be allowed to return immediately. Their work is urgent, and some of these dedicated public servants are trying to stop a famine before it's too late. The unprecedented expulsion of these UN officials follows a pattern of escalating obstruction. In July, an emergency director's group from headquarters was detained while trying to conduct an assessment mission in Tigray. 3 NGOs were suspended shortly thereafter. These actions are calculated to intimidate and silence, but they do not accomplish that goal. Instead, they push starving people to the brink. Conditions in Ethiopia today rival Somalia in 2011. During the onset of the famine. We remember that famine was hard. Over 250,000 people died despite warnings, and it didn't have to happen. Starvation should never happen, and the famine does not have to happen. The government of Ethiopia can choose to reverse course on the expulsion of UN personnel, and all parties to the conflict can immediately facilitate the full and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid. And if these calls for humanitarian access continue to go unheard, then the Security Council must act. We can ensure the UN is allowed to deliver impartial aid. We should immediately consider all tools at our disposal to facilitate this, including a Security Council resolution to save lives and promote international peace and security. Our concerns about the situation in Ethiopia go beyond this immediate humanitarian crisis. Colleagues, 3 years ago, we were talking about Ethiopia as one of the fastest growing countries in Africa, full of promise and on the cusp of a major economic and political transformation. Less than 1 year ago, this current situation was going to be a 2-week law enforcement action. Now we're hearing countless horrific accounts of rape being used as a weapon of war,
of violence against civilians, of hunger being used as a tool of war, of famine looming, of UN staff being expelled. Ethiopians killing Ethiopians, thousands by the day. And the conflict is spilling over into the Amhara and Afar regions, creating even more instability and humanitarian need. As the Secretary General said in his letter to us this week, this conflict is spiraling out of control. This is a path Ethiopia's leaders are choosing: to join the club of the most isolated countries in the international community, to let down their own people. The United States has repeatedly called for the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, as well as associated regional militias, to end the fighting now, allow humanitarian access, and move toward a negotiated ceasefire immediately and without preconditions. The Council should fully support these efforts too. There is still hope. It is not too late to stop this descent. The United States believes there must be a political solution to this conflict. We're investing heavily in diplomatic efforts, in partnership with the African Union and the region, to address this crisis and to end the carnage. We also believe there will be no lasting peace in Ethiopia, and the country's broader project of democratic and economic renewal will not be realized until there is a wider dialogue, one that includes all Ethiopians on the future of their state. So today's meeting represents an important step toward addressing the immediate and wider crisis in Ethiopia, but it cannot be the last. Make no mistake, the Security Council's credibility is at stake today here. We must take on appropriate actions. We must take all appropriate actions to keep civilians safe, to promote accountability for human rights violations and abuses, and deliver humanitarian relief to Ethiopians in dire need. We must all call on the government of Ethiopia to reverse the expulsion immediately. Time is of the essence. Lives are on the line. If ever there was a moment to step up and do our duty, it is now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of the A3+1, namely Kenya, Niger, Tunisia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines on this important crisis in Africa. I thank the Secretary General for his presentation and welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ethiopia. Mr. President, we meet today regarding the decision by the federal government of Ethiopia to declare 7 UN officials working in Ethiopia as persona non grata, in light of the previous concerns we have expressed in calling for maximum access to enable humanitarian aid to reach Ethiopians in need. We noted the persona non grata notice with concern. We say this in the full understanding of the duties and obligations that all humanitarian actors must respect in the conduct of their work. Nevertheless, the risks of a large-scale famine, which to a large extent is being prevented by the aid delivered by the organizations to which the expelled individuals belong, raises serious concerns. Even within their sovereign rights, governments should observe their domestic and international humanitarian law obligations. The rights of the Ethiopian people to receive aid in this dire emergency are of the highest moral and legal character. We strongly urge the government and the United Nations to undertake every effort to resolve any differences and get back to ensuring aid is delivered to Ethiopians in desperate need. Concerns regarding the expulsed individuals should be thoroughly considered on the basis of substantiated evidence and within a frank and genuine dialogue between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations. Discussing these issues publicly may not be constructive in the current circumstances, nor will it alleviate the suffering of the populations affected by the conflict in northern Ethiopia. The efforts of quiet diplomacy undertaken through constructive dialogue between the United Nations and Ethiopia are our best option to address this issue. In the meantime, we believe that priority must be given to the continuity of unfettered humanitarian assistance to needy people in northern Ethiopia. We welcome the renewed commitments of both sides in this regard. Mr. President, with the newly established government in Ethiopia, we reiterate that peaceful dialogue and democracy are the best mechanisms for the resolution of serious political differences. Today, we cannot help but return to this position, noticing with pain as fellow Africans the suffering of our Ethiopian brothers and sisters in Tigray and elsewhere in the country. The highest priority then at this stage is to declare an immediate ceasefire to allow for an unrestricted humanitarian access to the affected population, as well as for the re-establishment of public services in all the conflict areas. We recognize and welcome the government's extensive efforts deployed since the beginning of the conflict to deliver humanitarian aid and to enhance humanitarian access. We emphasize on the need to continue efforts towards the unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance and strongly encourage the Ethiopian authorities to fulfill all their commitments in ensuring humanitarian outreach to the people in need. The A3+1 recognizes the important role of UN humanitarian agencies and all humanitarian actors which should be supported. In this context, we call on all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. They should also ensure the respect and the protection of all humanitarian personnel and United Nations and associated personnel as reiterated in Security Council Resolutions 1502 and 2175. At the same time, we underline the obligation of all humanitarian personnel and United Nations and its associated personnel to observe and respect the laws of the country in which they are operating in accordance with international law, including the principle of non-interference. Further, we stress the importance for humanitarian organizations to uphold the core principles of neutrality, impartiality, and humanity in their humanitarian activities, in full respect of the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and national unity of the host state in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia is part of a much bigger and complex crisis which is unfolding with a potential regional spillover effect that may threaten peace and security in Ethiopia and beyond. With the hostilities expanding to Amhara and Afar regions, it is clear that there could be no military solution to this crisis, and that taking up guns will only protract the conflict. The A3+1 therefore calls on all Ethiopian parties to cease hostilities and to engage in discussion with a view to conclude a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire which would pave the way for an inclusive Ethiopian-led dialogue and to national reconciliation. We also strongly call for the withdrawal of all non-Ethiopian forces from Tigray and the standing down of all militias from neighboring federal states. The African Union has a major role to play to help Ethiopians in their reconciliation efforts so that they can protect their unity and territorial integrity and recover Ethiopia's status as an anchor of regional peace and stability. In this regard, we support the active engagement of His Excellency President Obasanjo, High Representative of the African Union for the Horn of Africa, to promote through political dialogue, peace and security in the region, particularly in Ethiopia. We call on all stakeholders and international partners to extend every possible support to the High Representative and to allow the continent the necessary space to resolve its challenges with the support of the international community. In conclusion, Mr. President, we, the A3+1, reaffirm our respect for and commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We stand in solidarity with our sister nation and in this trying moment in their pursuit for peace and stability. We hope that the new government effectively lays the foundation of a new beginning, especially by carrying the robust national dialogue on peace, cohesion, development, and unity in diversity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Secretary General Mr. Guterres for his briefing. I welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador Haile Selassie, at today's meeting. At present, the humanitarian needs in the Tigray region continue to grow. Food insecurity and displacement remain acute problems. UN humanitarian workers have overcome various challenges and delivered much-needed humanitarian supplies to many Ethiopians. China appreciates these efforts. The United Nations and other international humanitarian agencies should follow the humanitarian principles, help Ethiopia increase its humanitarian response capabilities, expand the scale of relief efforts, and prevent the deterioration of the situation. We call on the international community to provide sustaining resources to the Ethiopian government in order to fill the humanitarian gap as soon as possible and ensure that aid reaches all people in need. The armed conflict poses enormous challenges to humanitarian operations. We have noticed that the Ethiopian government earnestly assumes the primary responsibility for humanitarian assistance and has proactively launched its own relief operations. At the same time, the government is also actively responding to the concerns of international humanitarian agencies. Tremendous efforts have been made in this regard. At the request of humanitarian agencies, the Ethiopian government has simplified administrative procedures on multiple occasions, reduced the number of checkpoints, scaled up land and air transportation, and allowed humanitarian agencies to bring communication equipment into conflict areas. These measures have contributed to expanding humanitarian access and ensuring the delivery of relief supplies, and therefore should be positively acknowledged. Mr. President, China regrets the disagreements surrounding the 7 UN humanitarian personnel and noted the positions and concerns expressed by the Ethiopian government and the UN respectively. We believe that a solution can only be found through dialogue and consultation. The priority now is to engage in quiet diplomacy in order to prevent a deadlock. We encourage both sides to maintain contact, fully exchange information, work together to seek a solution, and avoid undermining existing trust and cooperation between the two sides. The international community should create a favorable atmosphere for a settlement through dialogue. Mr. President, a new government has just been inaugurated in Ethiopia. China expresses its welcome. China supports the Ethiopian government in making continued efforts to achieve unity among all Ethiopians, promote political dialogue, and work collectively to safeguard national unity and build a brighter future for the country. The international community should continue to provide assistance to Ethiopia while respecting the country's sovereignty and ownership. China supports African solutions to African problems and welcomes the good offices of former President Obasanjo in his capacity as the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa. the United Nations and the African Union should strengthen collaboration and jointly play a constructive role in promoting peace and reconciliation across the entire Ethiopia. I also wish to point out that the unilateral sanctions imposed on Ethiopia and Eritrea by certain countries are in breach of international law and the basic norms governing international relations and will serve only to disrupt political settlement. Such sanctions should therefore be lifted as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his briefing and for sharing his assessment on the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. I also welcome the permanent representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador Taye Selassie, in today's briefing. The humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia has been adversely impacted due to the continuing conflict which began in November 2020. Despite the unilateral ceasefire declared by the Ethiopian government to facilitate humanitarian aid to the affected population, during the recent months, the fighting has continued and expanded to the neighboring regions of Tigray. The Ethiopian population, particularly women, children, and the elderly, continue to suffer from the ongoing conflict. In this difficult situation, the efforts of humanitarian agencies led by the UN has provided relief to the population. The northern part of Ethiopia will continue to need steady supplies of humanitarian relief in the coming months. In this regard, we note with appreciation the work of humanitarian workers and agencies. However, the unfortunate expulsion of senior UN officials coordinating the humanitarian assistance has the possibility to adversely impact the humanitarian situation. It is therefore important to de-escalate the situation through engagement and dialogue. While we are not aware of the circumstances which led to the recent developments, we are of the view that the founding principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, should always guide any humanitarian action. Humanitarian assistance and humanitarian workers should also be sensitive to the situation on the ground and adhere to these principles, especially when the host state is facing a complex politico-military situation internally. We have noted the reports of diversion of humanitarian assistance by armed groups and others. Such incidents need to be investigated and corrective measures need to be taken. It is imperative that the United Nations and its agencies continue to work closely with the government of Ethiopia to ensure that aid reaches the needy in a timely and satisfactory manner. They cannot work at cross purposes. We hope that both the UN and the Ethiopian government will make purposeful efforts to resolve expeditiously all issues in the interest of the affected population. We should eschew politicization of the matter. India has consistently underscored the importance of mutual trust, engagement, dialogue, and reconciliation to address all issues relating to the ongoing conflict in northern Ethiopia. In this context, we welcome the formation of a new government in Ethiopia led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on 4th October and his announcement of an inclusive national dialogue. We urge all sides to exercise restraint and support the call by the Ethiopian government for opening channels of communication to build trust among themselves. We also welcome the voice of support to the Ethiopian government by the African leaders who attended the swearing-in ceremony of President Abiy Ahmed on 4th October. The work must begin on the restoration of normalcy in the lives of the people in the affected regions. To this end, we reiterate our call to find an amicable political solution in a manner that serves the interests of all its people in line with the provisions of the Constitution of Ethiopia. In conclusion, Mr. President, the political and economic stability of Ethiopia is paramount, not just to the Horn of Africa, but the entire African continent. The international community and the African Union need to support all efforts that are directed towards humanitarian assistance and an early resolution of the conflict. India reiterates its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for your insightful briefing. I welcome the permanent representative of Ethiopia to our meeting today. Mr. President, we all concerned about the deteriorated humanitarian situation in Tigray, especially its consequences and adverse impacts on the daily lives of millions of people. As responding to this humanitarian need in Ethiopia is the most urgent task that requires the international community support, we emphasize the critical role of the UN agency, including UNICEF, OCHA, and other international partners in this regard. Therefore, we regret the recent decision undertaken by the government of Ethiopia to declare persona non grata to 7 UN officials. We are afraid that the decision will affect humanitarian operations in the country. In this context, we call for dialogue, trust building, and cooperation between the government of Ethiopia, the United Nations, and other parties to overcome these differences so as to reach humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, we welcome some progresses of the practical activity carried out by the United Nations, including humanitarian organizations and international and regional partners, for 10,000s of Ethiopians over the past few months, including people in Tigray. Recently, the first round of food distribution to people in Afar and Amhara region have been completed by the World Food Programs. However, we understand that the access to and distribution of humanitarian assistance still remain far from satisfying the need of urgent assistance in many parts of Tigray. The conflict has resulted in other systemic issues that may lead to further deterioration. ADHG Martin Griffith said, 5.2 million people are in need of food aid, including 400,000 people living in famine-like conditions. In the face of such danger, we call on all parties to fulfill their obligation under humanitarian law to prevent a famine from occurring. It is crucial to ensure safe, effective, and efficient delivery of and access to humanitarian assistance to the Tigray region and bordering area. Mr. President, we also share concern of the international community, including those expressed by the Secretary General, about the alarming levels of violence and killing against civilians, including women, children, and humanitarian workers, as well as the destruction of infrastructures indispensable to the civilian population in Tigray. The acts of violence are unacceptable and run counter to the international humanitarian law. We call for an immediate cessation of hostility, upholding responsibility under international humanitarian law, and ensuring the protection of civilians, especially women and children. Mr. President, the crisis in Tigray stems from complicated political, historical, and ethnic reasons. The background requires relevant parties to engage in dialogue and reconciliation rather than further hatred, thereby creating favorable conditions for starting an Ethiopian-led political dialogue. It is high time for a compromise to be made toward a comprehensive solution for sustained stability and development in Ethiopia on the basis of principles of the international law and the UN Charter. We call on Ethiopian authority and all other concerned parties to give the highest priority to the interests of its people. In this process, the international community, including the Security Council, should support all efforts toward this end, in full respect of independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the conflict and situation in Tigray have had certain impacts on the region that require relevant parties to exercise self-restraint. In this connection, we support the constructive engagement of neighboring countries and regional organizations for peace, security, national reconciliation, national unity, and development in Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, my delegation thanks the Secretary General for his briefing and report. We also welcome the permanent representative of Ethiopia in this assembly. We noted with concern the assertions made by the Ethiopian government and which led to the expulsion of the United Nations officials. We have also listened to the very clear and comprehensive position expressed by the Secretary General. Now, before considering the arguments put forth by the two parties, we must first point out that the decision by the government of Ethiopia has a direct impact on humanitarian work being conducted on the ground. In just another month, it will be a year since the start of the conflict that has already resulted in thousands of deaths and millions of persons displaced, in addition to the more than 5.2 million persons now requiring food assistance. The work of the United Nations agencies, funds, and programs could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of persons. In addition to the obstacles to humanitarian work, we are concerned at the impact that the expulsion of one of the staff members of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights could have on the joint investigation being conducted with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, including an impact on the deadline that has been set for delivery of the final report, which is slated for the 1st of November. Mexico maintains its strong commitment to the United Nations and is convinced that its humanitarian operations are at all times governed by the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, as set out in Resolution 46/182 of the General Assembly, and that was in 1991. And this continues to provide us with the framework that defines the terms on which humanitarian assistance can be provided. However, whenever a state or a party to a conflict gives its consent, and by that I mean it agrees to the provision of specific humanitarian assistance, this cannot be subject to ad hoc decisions. Based on this consent, the parties involved must allow and facilitate access, that is to say, unrestricted access to humanitarian assistance. We must not forget that what is at stake here is the protection of the civilian population. The International Court of Justice, in its famous judgment on the Nicaragua case of the 27th of June 1986, ruled that the provision of strictly humanitarian aid cannot be regarded as unlawful intervention or as in any other way contrary to international law, provided it complies with the principles of the Red Cross and others providing such aid without discrimination. It bears repeating that in the exercise of these humanitarian functions, UN agencies and their officials enjoy immunities in accordance with the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations.
ጀነራሎቹ በግልጽ አስቀምጠዋል። አንደኛ የመለመሉት የሚቀመጥ አይደለም፣ ሁለተኛ ይከዳባቸዋል። የሚከዳበት ምክንያት ደግሞ ተጨባጭ ነገር ስላለው ነው። አንደኛ ሸሸ ተብሎ በጥይት ይመታል ከኋላ፣ ሁለተኛ ከፍተኛ ቁስለኛ ካለ ጨርሰው ነው የሚባለው፣ እዛው ነው የሚጨርሱት። ሶስተኛ የሚፈልገውን አይነት እንክብካቤ ያገኝም፣ እንክብካቤ አትሊስት የሚመገበው ምግብ ሊኖረው ይገባል። አራተኛ ደግሞ ይሄን ጦርነት የሚሸከም ማንኛውም አይነት ሎጂስቲክስ የለውም። ሰማይ ምድር ቢሆን ምድር ሰማይ ቢሆን ቲፒኤልኤፍ ህይወት የለውም፣ ተመልሶ ወደ ነበረበት አይመለስ። መጠገን እኮ አይደለም፣ ቲፒኤልኤፍ የሚባለው ታሪክ ይሆናል። በቅርብ ጊዜ ታሪክ እንዲህ አይነት ድርጅት ነበር ይላል። በሁለት መንገድ ይሆናል፣ በሁለት አቅጣጫ። አንደኛው ከራሱ ከትግራይ ህዝብ እና ከራሱ የሰራዊቱ አባላት እና የተወሰኑ መሪዎች ይሄን ይገለብጣሉ። ሁለተኛ ደግሞ ከኛም የሚሰነዘረው ምት ነው። በእነዚህ በሁለቱ ህወሓት በቅርብ ጊዜ ታሪክ ይሆናል። አይደለም መጠገን ስንጥቃቱን መጠገን ቀርቶ እስከነ አካቴው ታሪክ ነው የሚሆነው። በእንደዚህ አይነት ሁኔታ ይሄንን ምንድነው የምትለው የአማራ ክልል መሬት ይዞ አይቆይም፣ ባንነካውም ይበተናል። ምክንያቱም አሁን ህዝቡም ተሸክሞ አይሸከምም።
of 1946, to which Ethiopia is a state party, precisely to ensure that these officials can work without interruption and for the benefit of those who most need it. And it is for this reason that we underscore that any accusation leveled against the United Nations or its staff under the convention I just cited must be substantiated by firm evidence and followed up by consultations with the organization, as well as an investigation conducted with due process, which also includes the presumption of innocence, which is a general principle of law. Mr. President, humanitarian access in Tigray is a need for millions of persons, and the provision of humanitarian assistance should not be politicized. And it's for this reason that we therefore call on all parties in Ethiopia to guarantee unrestricted flow of food, medicines, fuel, and other goods needed to protect the civilian population and to meet their basic needs. We support rather the call for a humanitarian ceasefire and the withdrawal of foreign actors from Tigray and its neighboring regions to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches everyone that is facing desperate conditions. It is now time for us to put a stop to the suffering of millions of persons. We also back regional efforts to find a solution to the conflict, and to this end, any progress on the mediation track, whether by the recently appointed High Representative of the African Union for the Horn of Africa or indeed any other actor, will be particularly welcome. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
President, we are grateful to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for the information he has provided on developments in Ethiopia. We also welcome the participation in today's meeting of the Permanent Representative of Ethiopia to the United Nations, Haile Selassie. First and foremost, we would like to congratulate all Ethiopians on the forming of the new government on the 4th of October. The conclusion of the electoral process is confirmation that the Ethiopian political forces are ready for dialogue in order to find solutions to problems that the whole population of the country is facing, in order to develop the state, to promote peace and well-being. The Russian Federation continues to support the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of our friends in Ethiopia. We continue to follow very closely the development of the military and political situation in the north of the country. We still believe that the Tigray dossier is an internal affair of Ethiopia, and the national capacity for reconciliation hasn't been exhausted. We also believe that it is within the power of Addis Ababa to solve its own problems with the support of the international community, first and foremost representatives of the region. In this connection, we support efforts to find a resolution taken by the recently appointed High Representative for the African Union on the Horn of Africa, Olusegun Obasanjo. We know that he is already working hard and has established initial contacts with the Ethiopian capital. We're looking forward to specific results from this work. At the same time, we do believe that deliberately toning up international rhetoric as regards the situation in the north of the country and spiralling politicization of the humanitarian file only hinders the Pan-African organization's work for mediation efforts. Bearing in mind the seriousness of the dispute and the complex historical context, this will not be a speedy process. Therefore, only coordinated efforts and diligent diplomatic work, including through bilateral channels, can bear fruit. We are certain that pressure involving the UN Security Council, threats and resolutions, and the imposition of unlawful unilateral sanctions, and the creation of a toxic atmosphere in the media is counterproductive. President. As regards the humanitarian situation in the north of Ethiopia, we fully share the concerns as regards the growing humanitarian needs there. The region, which even before the crisis was unstable from the point of view of food security, is currently in particularly dire straits. The ongoing violence in Tigray and in neighbouring regions of Amhara and Afar are seriously compounding the broader situation and provoking new flows of IDPs and refugees. There are also specific problems that require urgent response, and which, as we believe, can and must be resolved immediately. First and foremost, we mean the situation surrounding the World Food Programme trucks stranded in Tigray. And we believe it is unacceptable to block transport from UN humanitarian organisations, let alone use them for other purposes. We've said on many occasions at the Security Council and other platforms that the media focus exclusively on the humanitarian situation in Tigray leads to a politicisation of this issue and creates further dividing lines in Ethiopian society. We cannot minimise the misfortune of people living in the regions of Afar and Hamar who have not been suffering any less, and also problems in other regions of the country. President. Russia has always supported humanitarian efforts of the UN. And we express our gratitude to humanitarian and medical workers who, in difficult and often dangerous conditions, provide urgent humanitarian assistance to all those who need it in the most remote corners of the planet, including in Ethiopia. Every year, we make our own financial contribution to the work of a host of programmes and funds. We intend to continue this assistance, providing experience and expertise to the humanitarian wing of the UN. We regret the decision made last week by Addis Ababa to expel UN officials. This, of course, will not help resolve the severe humanitarian crisis in the country. At the same time, we would call for not to dramatise what happened. We believe that through mutually respectful dialogue, Addis Ababa and the Secretariat will be able to re-establish trust and amicably solve the disagreement that has arisen in the interests of the people who need assistance. Here, there are still many questions, particularly as regards steps that were or weren't taken to prevent a negative turn of events. In this connection, it's particularly important to tread carefully and learn from this so that these kind of incidents don't happen again in the future. Much like for other situations around the world, we insist that humanitarian assistance should be provided fully in line with UN General Assembly Resolution 46182 and the UN guiding principles, as well as international law and national legislation. We must once again state the vital need for credible and constructive dialogue, and also close cooperation with the sovereign Ethiopian authorities, who continue to cover the lion's share of all humanitarian needs in Tigray and in neighbouring regions. In conclusion, we would like to reaffirm Russia's readiness to continue to support the normalisation of the situation in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa as a whole. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian.
ከዚህ አኳያ እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን። ከዚህ አኳያ እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን። ከዚህ አኳያ እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን። ከዚህ አኳያ እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን። ከዚህ አኳያ
for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Congratulations on assuming your presidency for the month of October. I would like to convey Ethiopia's best wishes in the discharge of your responsibilities. I also thank our Secretary General. Mr. President, I don't want to hide my surprise in the convening of this meeting of the Security Council. We find it incomprehensible for this august body to discuss the decision of a sovereign state exercised within the domain of international law and sovereign prerogative. There have been several instances where governments had expelled UN staff and other diplomatic envoys for so many disclosed and undisclosed reasons. Did the Council ever meet to vindicate such a decision? Not to the best of our recollection. Mr. President, we truly hoped Council members would have the insight to leave this matter to the government, Ethiopia, and the United Nations. At the outset, I would like to register our position that the government of Ethiopia is not under any legal obligation to provide justifications or explanation for its decisions. Excellencies, we are obliged to make reference to the basic norms of the United Nations and its humanitarian operations. The General Assembly resolution on guiding principles for humanitarian assistance 46/182 provides the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of states must be fully respected in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. The most fundamental element of the sovereignty of the state has to do with their prerogative to determine who enters, remains in, exists in their territory. When we appeal for support and work with the UN or other humanitarian operators, we have not foregone this fundamental right. Therefore, the government will continue exercising its due right and responsibility on monitoring and screening all humanitarian operators in Ethiopia. Any suggestion to the contrary is unacceptable. As to the legality of the decision, leaving the details aside, the UN itself can be quoted for arguing decisions of persona non grata apply to the UN as well. Mr. President, when it comes to the obligation of UN staff, the rules are unequivocal. Article 101, paragraph 3 of the UN Charter provides all staff members employed by the United Nations must have the highest standards of efficiency, competence, and integrity. In the context of humanitarian operations, integrity entails adhering to principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. It also requires respect for the laws and police power of the host state. Furthermore, they must respect the Code of Conduct of UN, which, among others, provides the following. First, UN staff shall neither seek nor accept instruction from any government or from any other source external to the organization. Second, staff members shall not use their office or knowledge gained from their official functions for private gain, financial or otherwise, or for the private gain of any third party, including family, friends, and those they favor. Third, staff members shall not communicate to any government, entity, person, or any other sources any information known to them by reason of their official position. These cardinal principles, for the safeguard of which UN staff enter a solemn oath and swear on their conscience, mean that in the presence of contradicting views, competing interests, political pressures, and all forms of temptation, the UN staff will remain neutral. In the presence of dissent, coercion, and vested interests, they will preserve their independence. And in the existence of consideration that may appear to be reasonable basis for decision, UN staff will be guided by humanity only. The UN staff Ethiopia expelled sideline their oaths, the rules of professional conduct, and the principles of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, let me cite few examples among the multitude of transgressions that we selected with great care and caution. Needless to say, the misconduct of few individuals doesn't speak to the professional and able team of the UN in Ethiopia or anywhere else. Rather, it speaks of the serious ethical dilemma that existed in the humanitarian operation in Ethiopia for the past 11 months. These individuals executed the conspiracy created by TPLF and its members to generate an image of extreme casualty that warrants quote-unquote humanitarian intervention and rescues the criminal group. To use their own words, they were looking to create a Darfur-like situation. They suddenly and overnight created 1 million victims of health disaster, while OCHA country office reports 2.8 million people that need emergency health assistance. The main OCHA office was made to report 3.8 million, only because that level of inflation of misery was needed to elevate the crisis to level 3. They categorized the situation in Tigray under IPC 5, based on data collected from a region of 6 million population by a single FAO staff and interpreted by 2 UN staff that are Ethiopian and open TPLF supporters based in Rome. They assisted in fabrication of false allegations submitted to the UN Security Council as a white paper. The white paper contained unfounded allegations, including the use of hunger as a weapon, and proffered the need to apply Resolution 2417/80. The former head of OCHA was made to report to this council 152 Ethiopians died due to food shortage, while such incident had never occurred. They made up the data and went to the extent of disinforming this global security body. About 2 weeks ago, they reported 12 individuals died of hunger in an IDP camp, while the organization running the IDP camp, an internal organization itself, came out and stated the allegations are simply false. They implored UN agencies to conduct investigations outside of their mandate to meet the instruction of TPLF to generate exhibits matching the false allegation released on media and to supposedly substantiate a case before the ICC. They didn't even show mercy to victims of gender-based violence. First, in violation of the protection of protocols of safe houses for victims of gender-based violence, they invited TPLF armed men and militia to the safe houses. In addition, they exposed the safe house before an international media and invited interviewers and interrogators to safe houses to intimidate victims and elicit testimonies. This, Mr. President, is happening in a city where close to 13,000 detainees and prisoners were released with absolute impunity, and thousands of armed youths are roaming in the streets, already creating terror on residents. These individuals recorded a UN staff meeting and gave a copy to TPLF for the sake of providing it with material it could use to back its false allegations. These individuals openly celebrated and make other UN staff cheer the so-called victory of TPLF and the withdrawal of the National Defense Forces from Tigray. They openly conducted activism in support of TPLF, a group proscribed as terrorists, and make political statements that instigate violence and inflame the conscience of the Ethiopian public. They assisted siphoning food, medicine, communication equipment, all other essential supplies and equipment and transfer to TPLF. Right before their expulsion, they were facilitating the deportation of ethnically segregated group of Ethiopian migrants from Saudi Arabia and their resettlement in third country in Africa for training and preparation before they join combat with TPLF. In effect, a parallel UN operation that completely sidelined the UN country office was created. Apart from the selfish interest of individuals, we have evidences that the entire endeavor is created by a higher and more sophisticated motivation that seeks to undermine the Ethiopian state and rescue the TPLF. Ethiopia deeply resents this experience. Mr. President, expulsion was not our primary course of action. In multiple occasions, we explained our concern to UN officials. On July 8, 2021, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Ethiopia wrote a letter to the UN Secretariat explaining in great details the misconducts of the UN staff that require corrective measures. We also summoned some individuals and warned them to halt their misconduct. Nevertheless, the transgression continued unabated. Mr. President, we believe the UN agencies and their honorable role are undermined by these few individuals. Our request from the United Nations is, first, to deploy new staff that are aware of and will adhere to their professional code of conduct. Overwhelming majority of UN staff fulfill this requirement and would distance themselves from political mercenarism. The government of Ethiopia stands ready to assist expeditious deployment of the replacement. More importantly, we request the UN to review all the reports, statements, and assessments that were produced on the situation in Ethiopia in the past year. These reports and data and information they contain must be verified. This audit is necessary for us to build and sustain interest and advance the exemplary cooperation between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations. Mr. President, the United Nations is an invaluable development and humanitarian partner for Ethiopia for many years. I want to underscore the great values we attach to the support of our organization during this difficult time. We also believe majority of the UN staff, we have the privilege of working with, have the requisite integrity and decency. Mr. President, I would like to reassure this Council, the new Ethiopian government established with the popular will and mandate of the Ethiopian people to herald peace and prosperity stands ready to work with the international community to address long-standing and current challenges. We welcome and value initiative by leaders of our region, the African Union, and the support of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres toward sustaining peace and stability in Ethiopia. We assure you that we will facilitate the visa requests. No one should doubt the Ethiopian tradition of hospitality. What we ask is respect, dignity, and honesty, open and candid discussion. We will, as we did in the past, we will always stretch our hands to all those who treat us with dignity and equality. That is, and this is the story of an Ethiopian life since the time of the League of Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement and invite the Secretary.
እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን። ከዚህ አኳያ እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን። ከዚህ አኳያ
If there is anything I have cherished during all this period, is to maintain a very effective and operational total, I would say, in a spirit of complete easiness, that I would like to ask you one thing, Mr. Ambassador. If there is any written document provided by the Ethiopian government to any UN institution about any of the 8 members of the UN that were expelled, I would like to receive a copy of that document, because I have not had any knowledge of any of them, and it would be very useful for me to detect if documents are given to the UN and not given to my knowledge, then I have to investigate what has happened in my organization. So I ask you, please, Mr. Ambassador, to provide me as a copy of any of the written documents written by the government of Ethiopia about any of the 8 that were expelled by Ethiopia in this regard. And I would recall that twice I told the Prime Minister that if there were concerns about lack of, I'd say, lack of impartiality of the UN staff, that I asked him, please send me those situations for me to be able to investigate. Twice I asked it to the Prime Minister. Until now, I had no response to these requests. And so, for us, the question is very simple. We believe that Ethiopia has not the right to expel these 8 members of the UN. We believe Ethiopia is violating international law in doing so. And we are ready to cooperate with the government of Ethiopia in relation to any situation in which the government of Ethiopia feels that any member of the UN is not behaving in total impartiality, in total independence, as humanitarian law prescribes and humanitarian principles establish. I want to tell you, Mr. Ambassador, we want to cooperate with the government of Ethiopia because we have only one agenda in Ethiopia, and that agenda is the people of Ethiopia, Tigrayans, Amharans, Afaris, Somalis, the people of Ethiopia. The people of Ethiopia is suffering. We have no other interest but to help stop that suffering. Thank you very much.
I thank the Secretary General for his further clarification. The representative of Ethiopia has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General, I hear you loud and clear. I fully understand and realize the support you have given to our people and my government as well. We know where your heart is. You have approached our issue with candidness, with candor, and we highly respect that. As to the asks, I will definitely communicate to the appropriate authorities, and we will, of course, expeditiously, and as I have made it clear in my statement, this is an issue that has to be dealt between Ethiopia and the United Nations. Whatever document that will be available will be submitted to your office, Your Excellency. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
ከዚህ አኳያ እግዚአብሔር ካለ በቅርብ ጊዜ ደግሞ ድል እናመጣለን።